Episode 10, Governance Without the Jargon. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fallen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with a family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about directly. And now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to. And I'm here to help you prepare to do that. Last time we spoke about risk. Not as a number, but as something that is part of your decisions, something that becomes more and more personal as responsibility shifts towards you. Now we move again, one step further. Because once you begin to engage with decisions, something else becomes visible, and that is the structure around those decisions, so-called governance. In practice, governance is very simple. It's a framework for how decisions get made over time. Who is involved, what is discussed, what is avoided, and how disagreements are handled. That is governance, whether anyone calls it that or not.
What does that really mean in a family like mine?
That's a logical first question. Since governance is rarely explained directly, you tend to experience it. Think about your family. Who speaks in conversations, who decides, who influences, and who steps back? Which topics are open for discussion and which are not? Every family has a way of operating, even if it's never been written down.
Isn't governance boards or committees that kind of thing?
It can be, but that's only one version of it, and often not the most important one. Long before anything becomes formalized, there is already some sort of system in place. The way you hold conversations at the dinner table, the way you make decisions in a small group of people, and the influence that sits with certain individuals, and that informal system tends to shape outcomes far more than the formal one does, particularly in families. We touched on this in our third session when we spoke about the fact that you're already inside a system, remember? Governance is simply that system, seen more clearly over time.
Like when some decisions are taken before the meeting even takes place?
Yes, that's a very good observation, because what you're seeing there is a difference between process and outcome. The formal process may suggest that a decision is being made collectively, but in reality, the direction has already been set through earlier conversations, through alignment between key individuals, and through influence that is not immediately visible. And if you're not aware of that, it can be confusing. You may feel that you're part of a decision when in fact you're being brought into something that has already largely been determined. It's not necessarily intentional, but it is something to recognize. You may recognize this from our last night's session where we looked at how decisions are often shaped before they're formally discussed. At this stage, your role is not to redesign your family system. It's to understand it, to observe how things actually work, not how they're described, but how they function in practice. Who influences the direction of a conversation and who does not. They can be small signals, I grant you, but they tell you a great deal. As we discussed in session 3, the first step is not action, it's awareness, seeing how the system actually works before trying to change it.
How should I know when to speak?
That is a common question. Governance is not only about structure, it's also about timing. When you contribute, how you contribute, and what you're trying to achieve by doing so. If you speak too quickly, you may not yet understand the situation fully, and if you speak too late, the direction may already be set. So part of this is learning to read the room, not in a social sense, but in a structural one. Where are we in the decision? Is it still being shaped or is it being confirmed? That difference matters because it tells you where your contribution can have an effect. You may remember we spoke about knowing when to step forward and when to step back. That was back in our sixth session. This is exactly where that judgment becomes practical. Another important aspect of governance is what is visible and what is not. In many families, certain areas are well structured. Investments, for example, or the business. There may be clear processes, regular discussions, defined roles, advisors, and then there are other areas that are less visible. Succession, control, differences of opinion. These are often handled more coolly, sometimes avoided altogether, and that creates an imbalance because the areas that are most sensitive are often the least structured. That creates problems over time, rarely immediately. Governance issues tend to develop very slowly. A decision that is not fully discussed, a disagreement that is not fully addressed, or a role that is not clearly defined. Individually, these seem manageable, but over time they compound, and when they do, they become more difficult to resolve. Now, governance is often presented as control, but that's not its primary purpose. Good governance is not about control, it's about clarity. Clarity of roles, clarity of decision making, and clarity of expectations. When those things are clear, control becomes less necessary. But without that clarity, control tends to increase because uncertainty creates tension. Tension leads to more rigid behavior. Most people don't experience that clarity because governance, when it works well, is often not very visible at all. It rather sits in the background. Things move, decisions are made, and disagreements are handled, all without drawing too much attention. It's only when something breaks down that governance becomes obvious, and by that point, it's usually reacting to something.
So, is the goal to make everything more formal?
Not necessarily formal, no. Formality can help in certain cases, but it's not a solution on its own. You can have highly formal structures that don't function well, and very informal ones that do. The difference is not the structure itself, but how it's used. Whether conversations are real, whether decisions are actually discussed, whether people feel able to contribute, or whether the structure is simply a layer over something else. In almost all cases, someone has more influence than is immediately visible. Remember session 5 where we looked at respect and the fact that influence doesn't come from position alone? Influence in families rarely sits only with formal roles. It comes from experience, from personality, from history, and from relationships. If influence is present but not acknowledged, it can distort the process. Decisions may appear balanced, but in reality, they're being shaped in one direction. And that is where transparency becomes important, not in a formal sense, but in awareness, understanding who is influencing what and why.
How can I navigate that without creating tension?
You don't need to confront it directly, at least not at this stage. What matters first is that you see it, that you understand the dynamics. Because once you see them, you can position yourself more clearly. You can choose when to engage, when to ask, and when to observe without reacting prematurely. It's a long process, however. Governance is not something you understand in a single conversation. It develops over time, through exposure, through observation, and through participation. And gradually, behavioral patterns become clearer. You begin to see how decisions move, where they slow down, where they accelerate, where they become difficult. And that awareness is what allows you later to contribute more effectively, not by imposing structure, but by improving it from within. There's usually a generation that holds the structure together, makes the decisions and maintains the relationships, and that can create a sense of distance, as if governance is something external, something managed by others. But over time, that shifts. Responsibility moves, and when it does, the system becomes something you are part of, not just observing, but shaping, And that is where understanding becomes essential. Without it, you inherit a structure you do not fully see, and that makes it difficult to operate within it, let alone improve it.
And what happens if the system itself isn't working well?
That's not as uncommon as you might think. In fact, many families operate with governance that is only partially effective. Things work, but just not smoothly. Decisions are made, but just not always clearly. Relationships hold, but with underlying tension. And from a time that can continue because the system is still functioning. But under pressure, those weaknesses do become more visible. And that is usually when change is considered, not before. So part of your role over time is to notice those areas, not to fix them immediately, but to understand where they are, because that understanding is what allows you later to contribute in a way that is useful, not theoretical, but grounded in how things actually work. And once you begin to see those patterns, something else becomes clearer. Governance is not only about how decisions are made, it's about how relationships are protected or not. Because every decision, particularly in a family context, sits on top of relationships between parents and children, between siblings, between branches of a family, between those involved in the business and those who are not. And if the structure around decisions is not clear, those relationships begin to carry the weight of it. Let me try and put it more simply. If a decision is unclear or feels unfair, or it's not properly explained, the reaction is rarely directed at the process. It's directed at the person. Someone feels overlooked or excluded or overruled, and what should have been a structural issue becomes a personal one. And that is where tension begins, not because of the decision itself, but because of how it was handled. What appears to be a disagreement about money or strategy or timing is often something different underneath. It may be about recognition or influence or trust. And when governance is weak, those things become entangled. There's no clear process to hold the decision, so it spills into the relationship. And once it's there, it's incredibly hard to resolve.
So, good governance keeps things separate.
Well, not entirely separate, but it does create enough structure that decisions can be discussed without damaging the relationship. It allows disagreement without it becoming personal, provides a way of saying, we may not agree, but we understand how this is being decided. And that makes a significant difference. As families grow, it becomes more important because complexity increases with more people, more perspectives, more interests. And without structure, that complexity becomes extremely difficult to manage. What worked for one generation often does not hold for the next. Not because people have changed fundamentally, but because the scale has. Different branches develop their own ways of thinking, different priorities, different levels of involvement. And over time, those differences become more pronounced. If governance does not adapt to that, it creates friction. Decisions are being made across groups that are no longer aligned in the same way. It can be difficult to manage, which is why governance, when it works well, evolves. It does not remain fixed. It adjusts as the family changes, as roles shift, as new generations become involved. And that adjustment is not always formal. Often it happens through small changes. Who is included in discussions? How information is shared? How often decisions are reviewed? Those things may seem minor, but they shape how the system functions. Information is also a key aspect. Who has it, who does not, and how it's communicated. In many families, information tends to concentrate in a small group, often for practical reasons. But over time, that can create imbalance, because those without information are asked to engage in decisions without the same level of understanding. And that can lead to hesitation or disengagement, or in some cases, mistrust. It's rarely intentional. It is simply how systems evolve if they're not actively managed. Information follows involvement, and involvement follows history. But if the system is to hold over time, that needs to broaden gradually in a way that allows others to understand what is happening, not necessarily to control it, but to engage with it. Advisors can bring structure, experience, and perspective. They can help formalize processes, clarify options, and provide technical input. But they're not the system. They sit alongside it. And if the underlying dynamics within the family are not clear, advisors can only do so much. In some cases, they may even become part of the dynamic, aligning, whether consciously or not, with certain individuals. And that is something to be aware of, not to question intent, but to understand their position. Most people don't think about that at first, but it becomes relevant over time. Because governance is not only internal, it includes those around the family as well, and how they interact with it.
How do I start to engage more actively without overstepping?
That's an important question, and the answer is a little bit more measured than you might expect. You don't need to assert yourself immediately or take on responsibility before you're ready. What matters is that you begin to participate in a way that fits your current position. You ask questions, not to challenge, but to understand, and gradually your contribution becomes more precise. It's now grounded in observation, not assumption. Governance is not something you step into fully formed. It develops around you as your understanding deepens, as your role becomes clearer, and as your confidence grows. This is also where the work you've been doing on your own identity, as we discussed in session 4, becomes visible. You're no longer just present. You're beginning to define how you engage. It's often the case that families bring in formal structures quite late, after problems have already developed. Governance tends to become visible when something goes wrong. A disagreement escalates, a decision creates tension, a transition does not work as expected. And then there is a move to introduce structure, committees, boards, formal processes. They can help, but they're often reactive, trying to address something that has already taken shape. Sometimes it works, but not always immediately, because structure on its own does not resolve underlying dynamics. It creates a framework, but how that framework is used still depends on the people within it, their willingness to engage, to communicate, to adapt. Without that, the structure remains in place, but the behavior does not change.
So, ideally, governance develops before problems arise?
Ideally, yes, but in practice, it's often a mix. Some elements are in place already, others develop later. What matters is not that everything is perfect from the beginning, but that there is awareness, that the system is observed, understood, and adjusted over time. At its core, governance is about people, how they interact, how they make decisions together, how they handle difference. The structures matter, but they sit on top of those interactions, not the other way round. And that is why governance without understanding the people involved rarely works well. Governance also requires a certain level of maturity, particularly as responsibility increases, because you're not only making decisions, you're contributing to how decisions are made. And that requires a different perspective, less focused on the immediate outcome, more aware of the process and the longer term effect. A decision may be correct in isolation, but if it is made in a way that damages the process or excludes others unnecessarily or creates tension that is not addressed, then over time it weakens the system. And that has consequences. Not immediately, but gradually. So part of your role is to hold both the decision itself and how it is reached, even in small ways.
How does that happen in practice?
often in quite simple actions, taking the time to explain a decision, even when it feels obvious, including someone in a conversation even if their role is not central, asking for a view, even if you already have one. These things don't change the outcome dramatically, but they change how the process is experienced, and that matters, because governance is not only about efficiency, it's about continuity, and continuity depends on the people involved remaining engaged, feeling that they're part of something that makes sense, not just something that functions, that makes a difference over time. And it tends to be cumulative. Small actions repeated, creating a pattern. And that pattern becomes the culture of how decisions are made, which, in the end, is what governance really is. Not the documents, not the structures, but the way things are done, repeatedly, over time. And once that becomes clear to you, you will begin to see that governance is not something separate from your role. It's part of it, even now, even in small ways, and that is where your contribution begins. There's one more aspect of this pressure that's worth understanding. It starts once you begin to make decisions that have consequences, because until that point, much of what we've discussed remains internal. But at some stage, your decisions start to produce outcomes, and those outcomes are seen, not just by you, by the others around you. And that changes the nature of the pressure again. Let's see, you may make a decision that works, that's well received, that fits, and for a moment that feels reassuring, as if things are aligning. But what often follows is not relief, it's a new kind of expectation, because once something works, it becomes a reference point. Not formally, but it's there. And the next time the decision is not made in isolation, it's made in relation to the last one. Equally, you may make a decision that sadly does not work as expected. Not dramatically wrong, but just not quite right either. And again, the effect is not always immediate. Often it is subtle. A slight hesitation in how others respond, a question that is asked in a different tone, a sense that you're now being observed, maybe just a little more closely. And what begins to happen gradually is that your awareness of outcomes starts to feed back into your decision making. You begin to anticipate not just what might happen as a result of the decision itself, but how that outcome will be interpreted. And this is where another layer of pressure forms, because now it's not just expectation in the abstract, it's expectation shaped by your own track record, however short this may be at this stage. This is just another form of the risk we covered in our 8th session. Not technical, but behavioral. How decisions are perceived, not just how they perform. You may find yourself becoming more careful, avoiding decisions that feel too exposed, preferring those that feel more stable, more predictable, easier to justify if questioned. Or, in some cases, the opposite can happen. A desire to demonstrate decisiveness, to show that you're capable, that you can act, that you're not hesitant. And that, too, can shape decisions, not always in a way that reflects your actual judgment, but in a way that reflects how you wish to be seen. The fact is, sadly, that your decisions are no longer neutral. They carry history. Over time, if this is not recognized, something subtle may begin to develop, a form of performance. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the behavioral one, where decisions are made not only on their own merits, but also in relation to how they will appear. The difficulty is that it introduces a second layer into your thinking, one that is not always fully aligned with your own judgment, and over time that layer can become more influential than you would like to realize. This is where the earlier point I made becomes important again, the distinction between what you choose and what you feel able to choose. Because as this new layer develops, the gap between the two can widen slightly. You may still feel that you're making your own decisions, but are they now being shaped by an additional consideration? And if so, how will this be seen? And if that question becomes too dominant, something else happens. Your decisions begin to optimize for acceptance rather than for alignment with your own thinking. There's also another element here, and that is time. At your stage, you're still early in the process, which means that the patterns you establish now are not fixed. They can change. If you begin by responding primarily to expectation, to perception, or to outcome, those patterns will become your default. If, on the other hand, you begin by grounding your decisions in your own thinking, while still being aware of context, a different behavioral pattern forms, one that is more stable. Over time, that stability becomes visible to others as well. People will begin to understand how you think and how you respond, and that in turn reduces the pressure. In summary, governance is not something separate from what you see day to day. It's not only the formal meetings or the documents, it's the way decisions actually happen, who is involved, how views are formed, and how people feel about the outcome afterwards. At this stage, your role is not to change it. It is to understand it, to see the system as it really is now, how it functions in practice now. Because once you see it clearly, you can begin to operate within it differently, more deliberately, more calmly, and over time, I hope, more effectively. So for now, just keep your focus on a few things. If you step back, you'll see how they connect to everything we've covered so far: the system you're part of, the identity you're building, the respect you earn, and the decisions you begin to shape. Number one, read the reality, not just the process. Observe how decisions are truly shaped. Notice influence, timing, and what is happening beneath the formal structure. Number two, choose your moment carefully. Avoid speaking too early without context or too late when direction is already set. Timing affects impact as much as content. Number three, contribute through understanding, not assertion. Ask questions to clarify thinking rather than to challenge. Focus on improving the decision, not proving a point. Number four, keep the system balanced and inclusive. Be aware of hidden imbalances. Avoid over-reliance on a few voices and bring others in where possible. And number five, think beyond outcomes. Look at how decisions are reached and how they affect relationships. Do not treat governance as external or purely procedural. Remember, you do not need to get this right immediately. But if you begin to see governance for what it is, a living system shaped by people and behavior, you will be far better prepared to work within it and eventually to help it hold. In the next 11th session, we move on to examine how families can lose everything slowly, with the knowledge that the foundation we're laying today will hopefully help avoid that fate for yours. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.